welcome to Marxism Festival Online 2021. Hope everybody had a really good time yesterday. I know there's some really interesting speakers and yeah, discussions going on. So my name's Sky, I use she, her pronouns. I'm a member of Socialist Workers Student Society in Liverpool. Today, the discussion we're having is Britain moving into a police state? A really pressing question. So the speaker we have today is Gary McFarlane. I'm just going to run through the order for today. So we're going to have Gary talk for 25 minutes. Then we're going to open up to some contributions and general discussion, where I'll give everybody 3 minutes each to ask your questions to Gary, make any contributions you'd like to. That'll run until about 1 o'clock. And then we're going to bring Gary back in for a wrapping up. And then we're going to end there. So without further ado, Gary, take it away.
Hi, everybody, comrades and friends. Is Britain moving towards a police state? Let's answer the question at the top and then try and explain ourselves. Well, we're not in a police state yet, I would argue, but our rulers are not averse to the idea. But for that to happen, some other things have to happen, such as the working class movement being smashed. And prior to that, there being a working class insurgency that they had to smash, if you like. We're not at that situation either, I don't think. But having said that, they are quite open to using police state methods in different points in time in history and in different places in history inside this country, which we'll look at. And I think it's also worth saying that it depends who you are when you ask the question, who you're speaking to. So if you're a Black person in the United States of America, the land of the free, it might feel like you are living in a police state. If you are a young Black male in London, where you're 19 times more likely to be stopped than anybody else, it might feel very much like you're living in a police state. If you're a working class kid in Hartlepool living on a rundown estate and the police are harassing you all the time, it might feel like you're living in a police state. If you're a Cardiff BLM activist, getting your door kicked down by the police has been happening in Wales and other activists, but it may well feel like you're in a police state. If you're on a peaceful protest in Bristol, sitting in a circle singing songs with your guitar and the police start truncheoning you, it might feel like you're in a police state. Also, if you're a member of a left-wing organization or a trade union that's getting too bolshy, the police will spy on you, and that might make you feel like you're living in the police state also. So, and perhaps it's worth mentioning also the families of 1,750 people killed by the police since 1990. All of those people still bereaving, still fighting for justice, I'm pretty sure feel like they're living in a police state, or certainly one in which the police seem to be out of control and can act with impunity. So just to give a bit of an overview where I'm going with this, I'm going to try and touch on 6 points. COVID, how that's being used as a cover for more repression, not just in Britain, but worldwide. The class origins of the police. What is a police state exactly? And what about crime? Because we can't actually dismiss that as a concern to ordinary people. And what do we do about that? More importantly, what do we do about the police? And lastly, what a post-police world might look like and how do we get there? So I'll try and cover that in 20-25 minutes. So COVID repression. Well, the world ruling classes have taken the opportunity of this pandemic to increase repression around the world. And some useful information data has been pulled together by Civicus Monitoring Group. And they've did a report last year, towards the beginning of last year as the pandemic was just getting going. So it's worse now. And they said that 87% of the world's population live in either closed, repressed, or obstructed societies. That's societies at some particular level, not necessarily police state, although the closed, I think, would be defined as a police state, probably. And they have 5 categories. So closed, repressed, obstructed, they're all pretty bad. and another two categories, narrowed and then open, which is obviously the best. And they looked at 196 countries, and they found that repression was getting worse over the past year. Again, this is a one-year time lag, so it's got even worse. So they said it got worse by 4%. And they said there are only two countries where things have got better, which was the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has had lots of upheavals recently and struggles from below, which is a key thing to freeing up society. And in Sudan, things have got better. Why? Because there was a revolution in Sudan. That revolution hasn't been completed to our satisfaction, but nevertheless, uprising from below leads to more freedom. I think that's a salient point we'll be bringing out in this meeting. And 11 places of the 196 looked at have got worse. So just to pull out a few examples: Costa Rica, Ivory Coast, Iraq, the Philippines, Slovenia. And there's another one, quite a big country. Let's pretend we're in school. Guess which country it is? Yes, the land of the free, the United States of America, has got worse. And where does UK fit in it? Because we're being a little bit UK centric, because we're speaking from the UK, people might be interested to know. We are in a narrowed position. So just one up from bottom. And that was prior to the advent of the police and crime bill, which is still just a bill, so it's not law, so it won't come into the stats, I guess. But if that does get passed, hopefully it does not get passed, we'll be moving up into obstructed societies, I presume, getting more repressive. And another aspect of the repression, which is important, I think, to talk about, is how ruling classes around the world have not just tried to ramp up and use COVID as an excuse to ramp up their repressive powers, but they've also done it in particular ways which actually pick on minorities also. That's always part of the toolkit, the divide and rule. So people from an LGBT community plus community have been picked on massively. Immigrants are being picked on massively, migrant communities, and other marginalized groups in society. So I think it's worth just stating that, because that actually runs through in the history of the police, where if you look in society, that's a key part of what they do. And we'll try and explain that. And I'll just quickly touch on, again, the police, and I just mentioned the police and crime bill, which people, of course, know about. And what's so draconian about it is the amount of discretion it gives to the police, so they can decide. They already have a hell of a lot of discretion as it is. I mean, know where that leads, but this is going to give them even more in terms of actually our freedom of assembly, and they can use whether a demo is going to cause disruption, make noise and nuisance, things that demos are meant to do, which means that theoretically every single demonstration being planned or taking place could, if the police wanted to, under this bill, which hopefully doesn't become a law, they could ban. And why are they coming up with these laws, and why are ruling classes around the world doing the same thing? Is because they fear what might be coming down the road, because the result of the pandemic, it's not just lots of people dying, it's who's dying, it's the poorest people that are dying. This just exposed the massive inequalities in societies all over the world. You know, in this country, obviously 127,000 dead, you know, of which the vast majority didn't need to die. It's because of Boris Johnson. He's a mass murderer. This is something else we'll come to. What crimes do the police look at? What crimes or what things don't they consider crimes? You know, but yeah, that massive inequality, and we see that writ large in India, where, you know, they are quite happy to see tens of millions or more people die in that country, but the ruling class at the top, they don't really give a damn about ordinary people. Okay, so that's the state of the world in terms of repression. And if you want to see where you fit on the map, go over to the civicus.org site, and I've got a nice map there which breaks it all down, nice color-coded map. But I guess if you live in a closed society, you probably know that already. But people in the so-called liberal countries might not realize just how repressive their societies are. So kind of have a look at the color of your country. Okay, the class origins of the police. The first obvious thing to say, I guess, is that the police are not a neutral body. I don't know if anyone's listening to Paul Mason and others who were debating fascism, and Paul suggesting that we could use some of the state's powers against the far right. Big mistake. But the main problem with that is that actually the police and the state apparatus is not a neutral body in society. They're there to do a particular job for the ruling class of this country. And I keep bandying around that phrase, the ruling class. What do I mean? It's that we live in a capitalist society where there is a minority that owns and controls all the wealth and the means of creating wealth, and they want to hang on to that power. And where do they get that wealth from? They get it from an exploitative relationship with the direct producers, that's you and me, who go to work every day, and they take a cut of what we produce every day. Might call that surplus value. And to keep that system going, they have a state that grows up. So you have an economic base and you have an infrastructure above that, of which the state is a part, and it maintains that functioning economic base and those class relations so they can continue exploitation. But as Marx put it in the Communist Manifesto, I think it is, this is, as you put it, sometimes hidden, sometimes open, or now hidden, now open, to use his phrase, in terms of actually this class struggle through the ages. Sometimes it's pretty clear what's going on. Other times there seems to be social peace, and therefore it's not quite as clear what the police are and that the state is doing these repressive things. So, for example, we're doing a bit of looking at the Drax family. People may have heard of a Tory MP called Richard Drax, who to this day still owns a sugar plantation in Barbados. I won't go into the details on that, but there's going to be a big coordinated international campaign for reparations around that. But looking back at his family history, which you can do, part of it anyway, if you go to the UCL site on slavery, which documents where all the money went from the money given to them in compensation after emancipation. So you can see all of the families and all of their wealth and so what they got and so forth. So you can see the Drax family. It does a little bit of history on the Drax family, and his ancestors in the early 19th century were responsible for getting the yeomanry out. When they were the yeomanry, they were basically the internal cavalry. They were basically the army, but for internal use, for keeping working people and the peasantry in their place. And so, as well as slaving in the Caribbean, they were brutalizing working people and people who lived off the land who are getting pushed into the new factory system. There's something called the swing riots that happen in the West Country. I haven't got time to go into the details, but the yeomanry are very active in that, in trying to smash that, well, they did smash that early movement of working class people. So that's what really the police are all about. It's not always as open as that. And they found new ways of doing that. That's why they invented something called the Peelers in London in 1829, named after Robert Peel, one of the founders of the Tory party. I think that also is relevant. And it's quite interesting. I haven't got time to go into all of the details in this, but a bloke called Lenin, a Russian revolutionary, described the state as really, when it comes down to you strip everything away, it comes down to special bodies of armed men and women. And that's exactly what they are. And so, yeah, when they created the professionalized police force in London, they are very concerned about this rising working class movement I just briefly touched upon there, and very concerned about making sure that their property was safe and there was no insurgencies going on in British cities, these booming, huge cities that are developing in the Industrial Revolution. So they had to get some social control and physical control of working people. So that's what the Peelers are all about. And they've consciously set out to give them a uniform that looked like they were nice people. Not nice people, because they're never going to do that, but they looked like that they weren't threatening people. So they wanted to get away from the idea of the police having these red coats, that's to say military uniforms. And so they put them in these nice blue coats. They gave them top hats and a little wooden truncheon and handcuffs. But they tried to make them appear as if they were just, someone walking down the road with a suit on and a top hat, so it wasn't too threatening. That was deliberate, but of course they were about violence, and they were about the monopoly of violence in the hands of the state. That's essentially what defines the police and police forces. That's why the word force is used, obviously. And the key thing about it, far from them being neutral, is that they are apart from our side. They're set apart quite deliberately, and they are above us. That's to say, beyond democratic control. So when I say set apart, you can see that clearly in the case of the UK, although might argue Tories are forgetting some of their history, because if you start not paying the police properly, they might not be as loyal as you want them to be. But generally speaking, they try to pamper them. And one of the part of the pampering, but part of the keeping them away from us, was that they had their own houses. They had a whole system of police houses. I'm not sure how widespread that is anymore because of all the cuts and stuff. But I think basically it's still a truth, but they don't live in the communities that they police. And that's quite deliberate. So they've kept apart from us. It's institutionalized violence, but it's also an institutionalized way of looking at the world, because they're there to do a job for the ruling class, which is to keep us in our place, which means that even if you join the police as a nice person, and all the Home Office surveys and research by academics shows this, you either change from being a nice person. When I say my definition of nice person is that you don't go around beating people up and stuff, and abusing people. But anyway, if you're going in there to actually help citizenry, to actually help people, because some people do join the police for that, you either end up leaving or you end up changing into being a racist, sexist bully, which tends to be the predominant canteen culture when you look at the research. And more than that, sadly, it doesn't actually tend to attract people that want to do good in society. It tends to attract bullies and psychos, I'm afraid. Again, we've got countless examples of that. I haven't got time to go into details when people, I'm sure, can give us their own experiences. So it attracts those sorts of people. So the brief, that's what the police do and what the police are. So there's a myth that we have this policing by consent, and that British police don't need guns and stuff and weaponry because we all love the police. We all love our bobbies. They're there to help old women across the road and do good things for people and get their cats stuck in trees. Well, actually, no, that's the firefighters do that then, so they can do that. But anyway, so yeah, we're meant to love our police. We're meant to think they're wonderful, and that's ruling, and it's all by consent, as if we've got some kind of democratic control. That is a total myth. And just going back to that business about sometimes hidden, sometimes open, you can see the real class nature of the police and the lack of consent when there's big class struggles. So just briefly, the miners' strike in this country in the mid-1980s, I think it was Paul Foote, a great campaigning journalist and member of the SWP, no longer with us, sadly, but he spoke about how it appeared that there was no crime in Surrey and Sussex on the basis that they moved all the police out of Surrey and Sussex and billeted them in the pit villages of Yorkshire and elsewhere to suppress and distance and try and smash the miners' strike. And that happened over a whole period of a year or so. Literally thousands and thousands of police went and occupied the coalfields, which showed you the priorities of the police. And the other part about which I mentioned earlier about the state in general and the police in particular, and the sorts of crimes and what they police. Well, the ruling class has a peculiar idea of what is a crime. So, for example, crimes against property is very, very much, I'll come back to this later, is at the top of their list. But actually, when it comes to some other types of crimes, they don't really get involved. So Grenfell, we're still waiting for the criminals to put the flammable cladding around that tower, and they're responsible for social murder. None of those people have been brought to account. And there's more social murder waiting to happen. I saw a fire at another high rise, I think it was in London, just a few days ago. And this cladding is still everywhere around the country. That is a crime, which is not being reported, not being investigated. We know who the criminals are, so it's not difficult to find them, but nothing's been done about it because actually some things aren't seen as crimes, and the laws are constructed in such a way as to protect the rich and the powerful and the capitalist class, and not to protect you and me. And you also see it in just in smaller things. Well, not some very big things actually, but Tory corruption, 37 billion wasted on the test and trace thing and giving backhanders to their mates. That is crime against property, you could argue, on a huge scale, but it's their property and it's them robbing, well, say it's our property, and it's them robbing us. So that doesn't matter, that's actually allowed. I remember I think it was last weekend, big Kill the Bill demonstration in town, in London town, and we're marching up the mall, and someone said to me, and we're just going up to Buckingham Palace, so we started chanting, arrest Prince Andrew. And someone said to me, why are you trying to arrest Prince Andrew? You're making demands on the police. We're not here to make demands on the police. Yeah, you do get sectarians to make silly points, but anyway, I've tried to be nice. So yes, it's not, it's not about making demands on the police. It's about showing up the priorities of the police. Yeah, but we're not going to do anything about the rich and the powerful being abusive and horrible sexists. Okay. So that's the nature of the police. What exactly is a police state? I think this is worth just defining what we're talking about here. As I mentioned with that report from Civitas, there's gradations of repression in various societies around the world, but there are a few things that we can pull out that could define what we mean when we're talking about a police state, which is arbitrary detentions and killings of opposition people and movements, and that's thankfully we don't get arbitrary killings so much, but actually again the idea that we've never had that in the UK, and the UK sadly still contains bits of Ireland. Actually we did have
5 minutes left.
We did have it. 5 minutes left, right? We did have it in Ireland, very much arbitrary detentions and killings, no freedom of assembly, no elections, no independent trade unions, a key thing I think we should all look at. And so in the various police states around the world, like Myanmar, Egypt, people are familiar with, but it's often seen as something out there, over there, somewhere else. But actually, it was only relatively recent history that Greece was a police state, was a dictatorship, that Spain was a police state, a dictatorship up until the late 70s, and Portugal also. So it's not something far away, but unless it was somehow it's never going to touch us. So I think that's worth pointing out. And where can police states come from? I kind of mentioned at the beginning, they can come either out of like working class defeat, or there's been an insurgency from our side, where people have tried to fight back, but we lost, and so they've had to clamp down. And you can see, two examples of police states. The two biggest examples, perhaps, are Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia, which both came out, were two sides of the same coin, if you like. They both came out of working class defeat. So the smashing of Soviet power, as in working class democracy inside Russia, and the smashing of a very big and powerful working class inside Germany after 2 attempts at revolution post the First World War. So that's where those states fundamentally came from. So that there has to be a context to it. Are we in a position where we're about to get our side smashed on such a catastrophic basis? Not yet, thankfully, I don't think. Yeah, so I've only got 5 minutes. So briefly, I was going to talk about crime, because it's important. People want to say, well, yeah, if you get rid of the police, what about who's going to sort out crime? But actually, only 1.6% of crime is violent crime, of all crimes committed. I haven't got time to go through the details. 5.7 million crimes altogether. About a fifth is violent crime. 1.2 million, and 3.2 million is thefts. So the overwhelming amount of crime in society is theft, crime against property, which I don't call a crime. I call that capitalism. And if we get rid of capitalism, we get rid of those sorts of inverted commas crimes. And then if you break down the figures about violent crime, actually you see a hell of a lot of it is repeat crime, and a hell of a lot of the repeat violence, and a hell of a lot of the repeat violence is domestic violence. And actually more powers for the police will not stop domestic violence, because they have a lot of powers at the moment and they do nothing about domestic violence in society. And actually that speaks to the fact that we need to change the kind of society in which we live, in which there is domestic violence, which means uprooting the family, which is the key way that women's oppression is maintained and transformed and repeated and continued. What do we do about the police? Briefly, self-defense is no offence. That's which means what it says. So we support uprisings against police repression in society, be it the 2011 London riots. I don't want to call them London riots because they actually spread all over the country, which is excellent to see. An uprising against inequality and racism triggered by the execution of Mark Duggan. So the Greens and the Mayor of Bristol were totally wrong to describe the uprising in Bristol, the fight back in Bristol, for example, which we would support. against the police, and they said it was people playing at being revolutionaries, and they attacked protesters. Even some so-called left-wing groups attacked the protesters, when in fact the truth was the police were the liars, claiming they'd had their arms broken, and actually that was proven to be a blatant lie, and they were the ones doing the brutalizing. So yeah, defunding the police, we would support defunding the police, and putting those resources into things like youth services, mental health, and so forth. And as the retiring Merseyside police officer pointed out, his name's Andy Cook, but if he was given £5 billion to spend on policing, he'd spend a fifth on policing, and the 80% he would spend on fighting inequality. That's from a senior police officer. It's the first time I've agreed with a police officer. Although I wouldn't do the 20% on the police. I'll forget about that. Which comes to the other point, which is to abolish the police. I think we should abolish the police, and people sometimes say, well, that's a bit out there, isn't it? But saying, well, actually, to abolish the police begs the question, who's going to do the abolishing? And that would have to be working people. So it actually we'll be talking about a pre-revolutionary situation, or a massive working class insurgency. And when that takes place, you have a revolution of rising from below. You have a festival of the oppressed. And so in places like Tahrir Square in the Egyptian revolution, women could go and walk downtown Cairo for the first time ever in their lives. It was a peaceable place. People organized for themselves. And just to finish, we want to see a society where the state withers away. We have a post-police society. And how do we get that? As I pointed out, things like crimes against property wouldn't exist, because we would own the property to the extent that there is private property. And if we're in control of our own lives and the products of our own labor, then actually you can start to think about new sorts of society. Instead of having a specialized police force above us, actually we take it in turns, don't have a specialized force, and it's totally under democratic control, and we look after antisocial behavior within ourselves, not as some people standing up above us. So we get rid of the state, and to get to that society we need a revolution. So join us in the Socialist Workers Party to fight for and make that revolution a reality.